So, my name is Nathan. I'm one of the pastors here at Daily Church. And today, we're going to be talking about something that's near and dear to my heart. It's a sermon that I'm calling Next. And the idea for Next, it came from the fact that we're always entering new seasons in our lives. So, as we enter any stage in our lives, we begin to get all worked up. We get all anxious, and we start going, okay, what's next? What's going to happen next? What's going to happen to me next? And sometimes that next big thing, it's easy to see. You see it a mile away. You get pregnant, you got 9 months to figure this out. Sometimes it happens in like 9 minutes or 9 seconds. You get into a car accident, boom, your life's changed. So today is all about learning one way of how to understand and deal with what's coming next in our lives. Because as Proverbs 27:1 says, we don't know what the next day will bring. Answer, probably fireworks. But generally, we don't know what the next day is going to bring. And I wish that we did. I'm sure you all do too. I'd love to just get a little glimpse. But we don't know. We don't know what's next in our lives. Life-altering situations, they happen every single year. And to prove it, whether we like it or not, it's one of those things we got to deal with. To prove it, we're going to do a little casual poll here. So I want you guys to think about the last 12 months, July 4th to July 4th, 2021 to 2022. Out of curiosity, raise your hand. How many of you guys have moved places you've lived? Okay. How many of you guys have started a new school year? Okay. How many of you have graduated from something? A few of you. How about a major death in your life? A major birth in your life? Start or finished a job? A major illness in your life? A major surprise like an arrest or an injury, a fair, a huge financial burden? Okay. How many of you guys, so let's collectively, how many of you guys raised your hands at least once? There you go. That's just 1 year. We've all had something that has come up. And most of us didn't know it was going to happen 12 months ago, or 12 weeks ago, or 12 days ago, or 12 minutes ago. So while I was writing the sermon, I usually talk to my wife about it. My wife's name's Jenny, and she's like, how's it going? I said, I'm working on this huge concept. I'm trying to answer, how do we handle what is next in our lives? And Jenny was like, oh, yeah, that's easy. Just trust God. Well, okay, I had this whole 30-minute sermon plan. She figured it out in about 2 words. And if she was preaching, you guys would all already be out having coffee and donuts. So just keep that in mind for next time. Like, maybe you should, and a few people from the 9 were like, can she just preach the 11? It's like, all right. I mean, yeah, the answer is, in the broad scope, super simple. We just trust God. That's the frustrating part about most next sermons to me, is that's where they end. The pastor gets up, he trots out a famous verse like this, one of the most famous verses in the Bible. Proverbs 3:5-6, that we trust the Lord with all our hearts. We do not lean on our own understanding. We seek his will in all we do, and he will show us the path to take. So the pastor's always like, all right, well, here's how we land the sermon. Just trust God. And you're like, well, thanks a lot, rocket scientist. I kind of had already figured that part out. And it's not that it's not true. It's totally true. It's just, it's an answer that leaves you guys walking out of here not much better than when you started, because most of you could probably figure that answer out already, even if you're like me and you don't tend to do it. So since we already know the answer, I was like, why don't we do this from a bit of a different perspective? Instead of approaching it as just trust God, let's flip the conversation on its head. Let's ask a different question. Let's ask this. Why don't we trust God? Do you ever wonder that? Like, you go through a situation, you're like, why didn't I just trust God with that? So here's what I want you to do. I want you to take about 30 seconds, and I want you to think of a time when something happened in your life and you didn't trust God. And then I want you to answer this question. Why? Why didn't you trust God? So I'm going to give you guys about 30 seconds to think of that situation and think of a good reason as to why you didn't trust God. Okay, so if you're like me, you came up with an answer. And if you're also like me, you feel a bit dumb for whatever that answer was. Because whatever it was, you start going, that's a really ridiculous answer for not trusting the God of the entire universe. It's one of those things that I love to say that, but it didn't stop me from trying to take things into my own hands. And the crazy part is I was actually going to get a microphone, I was going to come around and get some of your answers, but after I started doing some research, I found out that I can boil it down, 95% of your answers I can boil down as to why we don't trust God into one simple word: fear. We fear what's next. And I want to go ahead and define fear so that we're all on the same page. Fear. It is a distressing emotion aroused by impending danger, evil, pain, whether, and this is important, whether the threat is real or whether it's just imagined. Let's try another one. Fear. A feeling of anxiety concerning the outcome of something or the safety of someone. One more for good measure. Fear. The likelihood of something unwelcoming happening. And I'm not sure if you've ever noticed this in the definitions, but you don't fear what's already happened. You only fear, they're all future tense. You only fear what's going to happen next. Why? Go back to Proverbs 27:1. Because we don't know. We don't know what the next day is going to bring. So think about it like a horror movie. You're watching a horror movie, you're all built up and nervous and anticipating the fact that the boogeyman's going to jump out. And then he does, and you're like, ah! But 5 minutes after that, you're not living in fear of 5 minutes ago. Like, nobody's like, oh man, I'm so scared that he already jumped out at me that I'm not sure what I'm going to do. Like, no, that's not how it works. Nobody says that. That's not how horror movies work. That's not how life works. The past is set. And even if you're like, oh man, I'm nervous about this thing that I did in the past, you're nervous that it's going to come back up in the future. The past is set. The future is where we get our anxiety from, because we don't trust what's next. I love that the definition said, whether that threat is real or imagined, because it can cause you stress, because the likelihood it's going to be something unwelcoming. That's the basis of fear. So far, so good. We now know, okay, why don't we trust God? It's all based on fear. Which means today we need to look at fear from one specific direction and then discuss how we can combat that and try to see God with what happens next in our lives. So here's what we're going to do. The one big thing we're going to look at is the fact that fear tends to come from our ignorance. Now we think of ignorant as a pretty dirty word. Like if someone comes up to me and is like, you're so ignorant, that's super insulting. But let's look at a definition of ignorance to get ourselves in a better mind frame. Ignorance is merely a lack of knowledge or information. It's as simple as that. You're ignorant, you have a lack of knowledge or information. And if you know me at all, and some of you guys, quite a few of you guys do by this point, you know I like to make well-informed decisions. Most of you guys have had to take one of my surveys already, and I've only been here 3 months. I like collecting data. I really, really do. It excites me a lot. You guys really should be thankful. You should thank your lucky stars for our wonderful executive pastor, Rachel. In the interview process, I took months asking question after 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 question. I think the whole rest of the staff wanted to straight up kill me. But Rachel was a saint and patiently just taking time to answer every single one of them. But why did I do that? It wasn't to be a jerk. It was I wanted to make an informed decision. Because coming here meant I was taking a new job. I was moving my family to a new city, buying a new house, making new friends, getting a new church family. Like that's a massive life-altering step in my life and my family's life. So I wanted as much data as I could to make the best possible decision for my family and also to make sure that I was right for daily church, for this family. So, needless to say, you can probably figure out, I hate being ignorant when making a decision. And I hate when other people make decisions and I feel like they're being ignorant and it involves my life. That doesn't go over well. Then I have to preach this sermon to myself. But that's why ignorance causes me to struggle with fear. That I don't have the data to know I'm doing the right thing. And if you're a Christian, if you've been in church long enough, you probably would have somebody, when you get into this kind of panic, you probably had someone come up and say, relax, it's okay. God is in control. Or they said something like, don't worry about it. God has a plan. And they'll trot out a verse like this. It's Jeremiah 29:11. That says, for I know the plans I have for you. They are plans for good. They're not plans for disaster. They're plans to give you a future and a hope. And you were probably both thankful because that's a great scripture. But you were also probably a little annoyed at the person because it's a bit of a Christian cliche, and it is a whole lot easier to be the one saying it than the one receiving it. I completely agree. I want to affirm God is in control. But the fear comes when God's control looks like a mess to us. Yeah, God totally does have a plan for our lives. But the fear comes when we don't understand what God's plan is. When we can't figure out what in the world God's doing. And our ignorance starts to frustrate us. So we say, God, love you, think you're great, doing a good job, I think. But in this particular instance, I think I know better. And we take that situation, we take that matter into our own hands. We want that knowledge. And this isn't new. This isn't a new desire. In fact, it is literally the oldest desire that exists. Even if we have an account of the very first frustration of not trusting God because of ignorance. So we're going our Bibles all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. This is verses 1 through 7. That the serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild animals that the Lord God had made. So one day, he asked the woman, now, did God really say that you must not eat of the fruit from any of the trees in the garden? And the woman was like, no, of course not. We may eat of fruit from the trees. It's only the fruit from the tree in the middle of the garden that we're not allowed to eat. Because God said, you can't eat it, you can't even touch it. If you do, you'll die. The serpent's like, you won't die. You see, God knows that your eyes will be open as soon as you eat it. And what? You will be like God, knowing good and evil. And the woman's convinced. She saw that the tree was beautiful. She saw the fruit looked delicious. And she wanted the wisdom it would give her. So she took some of that fruit. She ate it. She gave it to her husband who was with her. He ate it too. And at that moment, their eyes were open. And they suddenly felt shame at their nakedness. So they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. That was the original sin. We wanted the knowledge. We didn't want to be ignorant anymore. We wanted to be like God. So we took our fate into our own hands. And you guys all know how that turned out. Spoiler alert, not well. You do a walk through the Bible, and you'll find us trusting our own knowledge over trusting God is going to come up time and time again. Abraham does it. Moses does it. These are like patron saints of the Bible. Gideon does it. David does it. Peter does it. Tons of them do it. And of course, we just talked last week. Zach did a brilliant series on Jonah. He is textbook study on thinking that you know better than God. God's like, hey, why don't you do this? Jonah's like, no. But perhaps one of the best examples is in Israel's first king. And his name is King Saul. And if you've never heard this story before, there's seatbelts on your seats, so just buckle up because this story is going to be a doozy. And nice. Somebody just like, really cool. No, I appreciate that you guys trust me that much. They're not literally seatbelt buckles on your seats. So we're going to go 1 Samuel. This is 28, 4 through 9, and this is 15 and 19. So the Philistines, they set up their camp at Shunem, and Saul gathers his army, King Saul, he gathers his army, all of Israel, they camp at Gilboa. Now, FYI, a little context here. What's happening? The Israelites, the Philistines, they're getting ready to battle to see who's going to get to take control of Israel. So pretty big stuff if you're the king of Israel. Verse 5, when Saul saw, that's really hard to say, when Saul saw the vast Philistine army, he became frantic with fear. And there's our fear coming into play. Plain and simple. So, what does Saul do? He asked the Lord. That's good, what he should do. But the Lord refused to answer. God wanted him to trust him. He refused to answer him by dreams. He refused to answer him by sacred lots or by the prophets. So now we find that Saul is ignorant. He's ignorant to his situation, and he's afraid. He doesn't want to be ignorant. So what does he do? Verse 7. Saul says to his advisors, go find a woman who is a medium, so I can go back or I can go and ask her what to do. And when we're talking about a medium here, we're not talking about like a medium dress size. We're talking about a person who can speak to the dead. So other words are like necromancer. Another translation says witch. And his advisors reply this. There's a medium, there's a witch at Endor. So we find out, okay, there's a witch at Endor, and who I'm assuming looks something like this. Yeah, that's the witch at Endor as far as I know. And by the way, if you did not know this, Ewoks are real. And they live in Traverse City, Michigan. See, I feel like you're laughing, but you don't believe me. Like, seriously, Google this. Pull up your phone, Google this. You'll thank me later. So, but do it after the sermon. So, 1 Samuel, I got to keep going here. Verse 8. So Saul disguises himself. He's wearing ordinary clothing instead of his royal robes. Then he went to the woman's home at night, accompanied by 2 of his men. Hey, I need to talk to a guy who's died. Can you call him up for me? And she's like, are you trying to get me killed here? You know that King Saul has outlawed all of the mediums, all who consult with spirits of the dead. Are you trying to set a trap for me? Now here's how we know that Saul knows this is a bad idea. Because he's the one who outlawed it for being a bad idea. Clearly this is not going to end well. So the witch at Endor, she calls up the prophet Samuel. Samuel says, now why have you disturbed me by calling me back? And Saul's like, well, I'm in deep trouble here. The Philistines are at war with me. God has left me, won't reply by the prophets or dreams, so I called you, so you can tell me what to do. Now translation, I'm ignorant, I don't like it, I don't trust God to handle it, so I've taken this, I'm figuring it out myself, and I need your help. Here's what Samuel says. All right, the Lord will hand you and the army of Israel over to the Philistines tomorrow, and you and your sons will be here with me. Now, for those of you who aren't catching it, where he is dead. So this is not a great forecast. Now, would any of you guys like to guess what happens next? Yes, exactly what was prophesied. Saul and his sons, they go out the next day, they're killed in battle. Why? Because Saul had to appease his ignorance. He wanted to have that knowledge of God, just like Adam and Eve, just like we do today, even when God thought it was best for him not to know. And the results were disastrous, as they often are when we pretty much choose our own wisdom over God. So now we've made it to a point. We got to figure out, how do we deal with this? We've got this idea. How do we deal with the fact that we have fear that comes from our ignorance? And the answer is understanding. Now, there's a very important distinction here. The distinction is, I did not say knowledge. I said understanding, and specifically 2 very important parts of understanding. The first thing we need to understand and accept is that we don't know everything. It's a little bit of a duh thing, because if I asked you, hey, do you know everything? You'd be like, no. So me putting it up on the screen, it feels a little bit silly. That we know we're not quite on the level of the God of the universe. But we have to be reminded of that constantly, because we keep thinking we do know more. I mean, how many times have you gotten yourself into trouble because you thought at that moment you know more than God? Socrates is a Greek philosopher, one of the most brilliant minds in history. And at the end of his life, he had spent his whole life just doing research and research and studying and studying and studying. Here was his summary of his entire life after all that study. He now knows that he knows nothing. One of the most brilliant minds of all time. And he realizes, man, in the grand scope of life, the universe, everything, I don't know anything. And because he understands his lack of knowledge, then he can begin the process of accepting that. So first, we need to understand and accept that we don't know everything. And the best part of this is, God knows that. He knows we don't know everything. And I'll take it one step further. He knows we can't know everything. And that's why he says this in Isaiah 55. He says, you got to understand that my thoughts are nothing like your thoughts. And my ways, they are so far beyond anything you could ever imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. So I know we can't fathom this, but think of the outer reaches of space from where you're sitting right now. That's the distance. So first, we understand and accept we don't know everything. And that brings us to our second, more comforting part of understanding. That we can understand and accept that God knows more than we do. I know, another nothing, but in reality, we struggle with this too. And the weird part, I was thinking about this week, the weird part is that it's easy for us to accept that other humans know more than we do. Like, I'm not trying to fix my car. I understand my ignorance, and I accept that a mechanic knows more than I do. If I'm going in for surgery, I understand my ignorance, that I do not know how to knock myself out. So I accept that the anesthesiologist knows more than I do. And really, we could have a very, very long sermon, because I can go all day of the very long list of things that I don't know. And you probably could too. So if we can understand and accept that other humans know more than we do, how can we do better at accepting that with God? So I'll go ahead and ask a bit of a follow-up question here, which is, how do you find a human that knows more than you do? How do you find a good, trusted mechanic? How do you find a good doctor? How do you find a good, trusted lawyer? It's like, well, if you're like me, you do some research, you check references, you know their credentials. Okay, fair enough. So to help with God, let's try to do the same thing. And fortunately, there is a great book of research on God. It's called the Bible. I highly recommend it. It has tons of good references. It even gives God's credentials. And there are hundreds of verses, but I narrowed it down to a beautiful one that brings it to 3 simple words. 1 John 3:20. He knows everything. I can give you, like I said, I can give you 100 verses to back this up or elaborate on it. But that's the sum of God's resume. That's his header right there. He knows everything. And to me, knowing everything's a pretty good set of credentials. So at that point, we can start to loop back. We can ask, why don't we trust God? We know it's because of fear. Specifically, a fear that comes from our ignorance, that we don't know what's coming next. And it freaks us out, it scares our pants off. And we know the solution to this fear is to move from ignorance to understanding, that we can accept that we don't know everything. And after we get that down, then we can take our next step. We can understand and accept that God knows more than we do. And fortunately for us, this is the beautiful part. God isn't distant. He's not impersonal. We can have a personal relationship with the God who knows everything. We just have to humble ourselves. This is Matthew 23, verses 11 and 12. The greatest among you must be a servant. And you see this mirrored so many times in what Jesus says, the Beatitudes and so many other places. You think you're so great. The greatest is a servant. Those who exalt themselves, they think they know the most, they think they can do the most, they're going to be humbled. But those who humble themselves, they're the ones that are going to be exalted. Believe me, guys, I completely get it. We want to be self-sufficient. I want to be self-sufficient. I want to be in charge of my life. We want to know everything. But the Bible says we need to take the exact opposite approach. We need to not live in pride, not live in self-sufficiency. Now, if we can humble ourselves, if we can admit our ignorance and take the form of a servant to God's will, that's when we begin to move closer to God. That's when we begin to understand that we can know him and that the one who has a cosmic master plan is there for us. And we've seen that plan fulfilled time and time and time and time again throughout the Bible and throughout our lives. So we can rest in the fact that he will show us what's next. And best of all, the one who knows everything is the same one who loves us deeply, and he loves us passionately, and he wants the best for us. If we can truly understand and accept that, then we can begin to make progress in trusting God with the things that come next in our lives. Let's pray. God, we do want to know what's next in our lives. I know it. I'm that way. I want to know what's next. I want to know what's happening tomorrow. I get that. But I pray that we can remember that every time we take things into our own hands, it goes poorly. I pray that the next time we have something big pop up in our lives, that we can humbly seek you. That we dig into the Bible, that we get on our knees in prayer, that we grow close in discipleship with other believers. God, you've given us those resources to help us know you and learn to trust you. So I pray that we don't abandon them, that we don't forget them in times of trouble, but that we use them every single day. Finally, I pray that we humble ourselves, that we give up control, and that we let you lead us today and lead us this week as we move into whatever the next big thing is that you have for us. And I pray all these things